since we're on our last philosopher, William Irwin Thompson, that I would sneak another one in on you, and basically Joseph Campbell. So I wanted to, Campbell and Thompson make an interesting pair because they didn't like each other much at all. They were good Irish, good fighting Irish, both of them were of Irish descent. And I guess you could say that Campbell didn't have any particular animosity for Thompson. I don't think he cared who Thompson was. But that rubbed Thompson the wrong way, and he had a kind of confrontation with him apparently at one point, and sent him a copy of the manuscript of his book, The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light. And Campbell, everybody was sending Campbell manuscripts all of his life. And when I went to, for example, to visit the Joseph Campbell Archives at Pacifica Graduate Institute, the lady there had a manuscript that was never opened of Richard Adams' Watership Down, which Richard Adams had sent to him to read. And Watership Down, of course, was based on the monomyth of the hero's journey from the hero with 1,000 faces. So he never bothered reading these manuscripts anyway. So now Campbell was born. Campbell is coming out of the same generation as Arthur Young and Gebser. He was born in 1904, and I don't have his birth chart, although I know it's out there circulating. I just haven't come across it. He was born in 1904, and sort of spent some time as a young student. He started off studying the Arthurian romances and got his master's degree on that. And while he was in Europe, he decided he wanted to learn French because most of these romances were written in French, and then he discovered that there was a bunch. Actually, the most important one, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, was written in German. So then he went to go and learn German so that he could read those. And then about the time that he was in France in the late 20s, the whole modern art movement was in swing and was going on. And there he was introduced to that whole world of Picasso and Joyce and all of these wonderful things, Thomas Mann. And he sort of came back as a young student from his European sojourn right when the stock market crashed and there wasn't a job in the world. And he sort of wandered around without a job, drifting. He went out to the West Coast, where for a time he lived with John Steinbeck, and the two of them kicked around in Carmel. And John Steinbeck sort of was still at that time an unknown. And the party that's described in Cannery Row was actually a party that was given for Campbell. It's based on that. And so they're out there, and then while Campbell's out there, he's wandering in the library in Carmel and just happens to stumble across The Decline of the West by Oswald Spengler, and picked that up, started reading it, and that really changed his whole life, intellectually speaking, from that point on. And so he began to spend the next few years studying Spengler and building his historical studies out of Spenglerian scholarship. And then, moving right along, as time went by, he began to become more and more interested in the wisdom of the Far East, India specifically. He met a Swami Nikhilananda, who was editing the works of Sri Ramakrishna. And he got Campbell to help him do some of the translating out of Sanskrit into English for the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and then did some work on the Upanishads. And then about this time he met probably the most important figure in his life was Heinrich Zimmer. And Heinrich Zimmer was this absolutely incredible scholar of Hindu art, culture, and literature. And the book that he wrote on mandala symbolism was the book that introduced Jung to the concept of the mandala, so that Jung borrowed the whole mandala idea from Heinrich Zimmer. And Jung and Heinrich Zimmer were very good friends. They were both kind of the stars of the show at the Aranos conferences, which were given on the Swiss-Italian border and at Ascona. And these wonderful conferences where they would invite, as a kind of countercurrent to the chaos of World War II, they were inviting these scholars to come in and lecture on mythology, basically with a Jungian orientation, although not exclusively, but primarily on mythology. And Campbell was invited to lecture there initially in the early 50s, and he was an unknown. Nobody knew who he was. He gave a lecture there. The first American who had been invited there to give a lecture. These were really Europeans, rooted in the European tradition, like that scene in Godfather Part 3 where Michael Corleone is this outsider American who wants to get into the old European tradition, and they just don't want him in there at all. So he had to kind of prove himself, and the next year he was invited back and gave a very brilliant lecture, and gradually just sort of worked his way into this culture. And then Heinrich Zimmer died, and he died in the middle of a lecture series. Heinrich Zimmer had, during World War II, had originally come over to Europe as part of the wave of German scholars that were emigrating over here when the Nazis came into power. And Zimmer was sort of rescued by the ladies of the Jung Foundation at Columbia University. They got him a little lecture pulpit up in an attic in one of the libraries. And he started lecturing there, and Campbell showed up at one of the lectures, and it was just an absolutely incredible introduction to the whole world of the Orient. Then Zimmer dies, and Zimmer's widow asks Campbell to undertake the editing of Heinrich Zimmer's writings. So he takes over, and he's studying Zimmer and sort of organizing the lectures that Zimmer had given in English into these volumes, so that Myths and Symbols in Indian Art and Civilization, this little book, is the best introduction to Indian culture and art and symbolism that you're going to find. It's short and readable and very direct. And then that was followed by a little book called The King and the Corpse, and then Philosophies of India. And Philosophies of India is one of the best overviews of Indian philosophy that you can find. And then this two-volume masterpiece on the art of Indian Asia, which is now out of print and impossible to find. And so then Campbell journeyed to India. He's been studying all this stuff, and then he decided to go see the Hindus firsthand. Heinrich Zimmer had never made it over to India. He had always wanted to go there and had planned a couple of trips, but never did make it. And so Campbell goes over there, and this is in 1954, right about 54, 55. And the Hindus at this time aren't interested in metaphysics. They're interested in politics. And Campbell, on the other hand, was interested in learning about the classics of India's past. So he had a rather frustrating time in India where, he was constantly besieged by beggars coming up to him asking for alms, and he saw that as a sort of miniature version of Indian civilization nowadays as a kind of gigantic beggar asking for help from the West, and then turning around and deriding the West as materialistic and vaunting India as spiritual. Whereas here was India in its decadent phase that had fallen into a total preoccupation with politics and patriotism. And this is the post-Gandhi era, after the British had been kicked out. And so they're really obsessed with all that. And Campbell just had a very, very difficult time. And I actually began working on his diaries. I was working with the Joseph Campbell Foundation on these diaries, and I was sort of writing footnotes. And while he was over there, this whole experience in India, then he went to Japan. Whereas in Japan, the Japanese struck him as really having their act together. In India, there was this sort of whining and dishevelment, and the machines were never properly in good repair, and there was dirt and filth everywhere. But the Japanese, on the other hand, had this clean, elegant, well-organized culture with this Zen-like tradition of doing things competently, right, and well. And that was the kind of guy he was, this classical gentleman who always wore this sort of suit and tie when he lectured. And Japan just really turned him on. And then he began to realize that the differences between the cultures, the differences between Japan and India were such that he decided that he wanted to write a volume addressed to the differences between these high civilizations. Because his first book had been published in 1949, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and as the title implies, it was this sort of look at the survey of all the world's great mythologies as basically variants of the monomyth, what is popularized now as the hero's journey. And the monomyth is just this myth of, the hero separating from the known world, being initiated into the abyssal powers of darkness, coming back from that world into the society and reinvigorating a dying society through the powers that the individual has acquired during the confrontation with the abyssal powers. And of course, that's exactly the structure of the original Star Wars trilogy, because George Lucas copied this structure from Campbell's book, and that's exactly the idea system that you get there. But that book had been based on a kind of Jungian orientation whereby we're sort of looking for this one single archetype, and we're sort of smashing all the myths together so that they'll fit into this one schema. And it kind of ignores the differences between the cultures. And Campbell now felt, after his Hindu trip in the middle of the 50s, that it was time to address the differences between these high civilizations. And so in that respect, he began to shift mentors from Jung to Spengler, because Spengler, as we have seen, has shown how all these great civilizations each have their own informing idea, and that organizes the productions of the technology and culture and science of that civilization in question, and that the civilization's production forms cannot be understood properly without a reference to that civilization's informing idea.